FNAF World is one of the most unique FNAF games ever made, with it being the only official FNAF game that plays like an RPG, which has turned this game into something of a fan favourite or a cult classic for those in the series. And part of that has to do with the vast amount of characters with cool movesets and powers that are in this game. However, one huge problem with this game is that some characters just get left behind because they either share moves with better characters or just have useless moves to begin with. And considering that every character has so much personality, I think it's only fair if we try to rework FNAF World to give every single character a completely unique mechanic. I'll be coming up with abilities, powers, and ideas on what each one of the FNAF World playable characters would do. And with that, don't forget to subscribe, and let's get into the video. So for starters, I will only be discussing the main 40 playable characters in FNAF World, and won't be touching any of the Halloween characters or enemies, though I might mention a few changes I would make here and there. Secondly, I think the best way to make this video as interesting as possible is to give every character only one move. And I know that's a bit redundant considering that this is an RPG game, and the multiple moves are what make the characters interesting, but let's be honest, do you ever use multiple moves on one character? But don't worry, I'll be coming up with a main attack and what I will be calling a superpower, where once the fight has been going on long enough, you can activate this special ability for certain debuffs, and yes, I stole this idea from FNAF World Refreshed. But anyways, let's start with our main man, Freddy Fazbear. Freddy being the main star of the show in both this game and others gives me a really cool idea for his ability. His move would be called Main Attraction. This move would be similar to Cosmic Song from the base game, except it would be a lot weaker, not dealing as much damage, although obviously leveling him up would improve this ability. Once Freddy is charged up, his superpower would be called Main Event, and this would, in my opinion, be also like a weak version of a fourth wall attack, only dealing between 150 to 300 damage at level 1, where Freddy could take off his hat and sing, revealing the power. I think this would be a pretty cool idea to kinda highlight that Freddy is the main man of the series, and still making him somewhat strong in both the beginning of the game and into the mid to late game, although my plan is to do that for most of the cast. Next up we have Bonnie, and honestly I really like Bonnie's abilities already, but if I had to pick one, I would pick two. I would make this move be called Bonnie's Guitar, which works as both a weaker version of both Bash Jam and Happy Jam, creating a new move that provides both effects, but to balance it out, both effects are half as good as usual on level 1, making him versatile but not incredible without some levels. For his superpower, I like the name Rabbit Rage. Using this move, Bonnie will literally throw his guitar at an enemy, dealing massive damage, probably between 200 to 400 for level 1, but it would only work on one enemy, which would make him a really good character with some balancing to make him not super OP. In base FNAF World, Chica is arguably the worst character in the entire game, since all three of her healing abilities are pretty terrible. Although I do like the idea of her being a healer, so I will just make her moves based on healing but actually make them good. Her main move will be called Pizza Party, which I think is just so fitting. Chica will give everyone on the team a pizza, which would give as much healing as base game Happy Jam 1, which is actually better than all of Chica's main healing moves in FNAF World. These pizzas would also give slight buffs to strength and speed for 15 seconds, which would also really help Chica's support role. Chica's superpower is going to be a bit interesting, and that is Cupcake Attack. This move, in my opinion, would work like Munchies, where Chica will launch a cupcake onto the enemy with the most health and attack them, and would deal between 20 to 30 damage per bite, up to 5 bites. And when this move activates, the 20 to 30 health from the enemy would be transferred to the party member with the least amount of health, and alternate as a buffed healing ability, almost like a power drain attack, which I think would be really cool and actually make Chica a useful character. Next up we have Foxy, who I think should retain his moves, and I'll explain what I mean. I think that Foxy should be a support / slowdown character, with his main move being Jump Scare. However, I will rework this ability a bit just to make it a tad more useful. Jump Scare would stun the enemy between 5 to 10 seconds and cause them to deal half as much damage as usual for the next 10 seconds afterwards. And if it's a boss, these effects are half as effective, so stun for 2.5 to 5 seconds and only dealing half damage for the next 5 seconds. However, Foxy's real strength would come in his superpower, which has to be Hot Cheese. However, again, I want to change the move just a bit. The move itself won't change, with an enemy stuck in the cheese getting damaged over time. However, for one, there would be way more cheese puddles, about 6 to 8 would spawn, and the enemies in the cheese would be slowed and weakened until the puzzle is solved, which I think would make Foxy one of the weakest characters on the main team. However, I still think he is powerful enough support, but having him on the team could buff other characters tremendously. So now we move on to the toy animatronics, starting with Toy Freddy, whose main move I will call Gaming Buddy, which would be an interesting move where Mr. Hugs would spawn in and run towards an enemy and explode, dealing a bit of damage. And yes, I know the UCN joke wasn't technically in the franchise at this time, but just roll with him. And for his superpower, FNAF World Refreshed, I'm sorry, but I'm still in Rage Quit, and to be honest, I wouldn't change how that works in that game, having a 50% chance to either instantly kill an enemy, or a 50% chance to instantly kill a teammate, which is a concept I just think is really funny, but may make him a slight liability in certain scenarios. Next up, we have Toy Bonnie, who also has a guitar, and yes, I'm calling this move Toy Bonnie's Guitar. However, it would have slightly different effects as it would heal your party and debuff the enemies with a random debuff for 30 seconds, so speed, defense, or strength. And for his superpower, I would go with the good reliable Toy Bonnie RNG. And this comes from the fact that in FNAF 2, Toy Bonnie can kill you quite easily by just never moving his fat ass out of the vent. And this move would be sort of similar to Rage Quit, where it's chance based, but the effects are different. Toy Bonnie has a 50% chance to permanently apply a debuff to your enemies or to your party, which could either really help you or just fuck you over. Toy Chica is next, and for her ability, again, she's a healer. However, I think this should be the character that has party favors, which is an existing move in the game, but is very weak. So to compensate, I would buff the ability to be twice as effective on level 1, with it going up with levels. And for Toy Chica's superpower, I gotta go with the voice box, where Toy Chica will say her famous line over and over again, dealing damage over and over, and debuffing the enemy's defenses, which I think is just very fitting and would be a nice effect, minus the constant noise. And speaking of constant noise, Mangle is our next character we'll be messing with, and for her, what even is Mangle's gender? Ah, okay, that's helpful. Anyways, Mangle's power would be Limb Toss, where Mangle would straight up throw their fucking leg at the enemy, dealing decent damage, since getting hit in the head with a large metal object would obviously hurt. And for Mangle's superpower, I'm gonna go with something called Radio Static, which I think would work in a similar way to Toy Chica's power, except it would debuff the enemy's strength. I couldn't really think of anything else for this power, but I still think it would be really cool nonetheless. But with that, we have covered all the main 8 starter animatronics, which makes me want to ask, do you think this would make the starter character challenge easier or harder? But anyways, let's go over the rest of the cast. So first up, we have Balloon Boy, who of course would have the move Balloons, which would work very much the same as it does in the base game, but just a tad stronger. However, his superpower would be called Flashlight Batteries, in which batteries just start raining from the sky, dealing damage to multiple enemies for about 15 seconds, which I think is just hilarious. Not much else to say, I just think this would be very funny. So now we have the other balloon child, JJ. JJ is a bit harder to come up with a unique power for, since she didn't really have a role in the main FNAF games until later, which does give me 2 ideas. The main move is called Purple Balloons, which would be the same as normal balloons except doing slightly less damage but also has a debuff effect, giving enemies a glitched effect which basically gives them a speed debuff. Their superpower would be Door Controls, which is a reference to how she disables the doors in UCN. This power could result in a massive door falling from the sky and dealing massive damage to all enemies, which would be a very fun move for sure. So now we have the first of the Phantom animatronics and the last of the Balloon Kids. We have Phantom Balloon Boy, who will, surprise surprise, they'll have Toxic Balloon, which would work the same as it does in the normal game, but with slight buff to make it a bit worthwhile. And for their superpower, I gotta go with Gloom Balloon, which would work very differently to how it does in the base game. It would give all the enemies the defense debuff as usual, but it would also put a balloon on each enemy's head, which would pop once the enemy attacks, dealing massive damage to the individual, which could be a cool piece of microplay in order to not just spam speed debuffs. Next, we have Phantom Freddy, who is honestly a bit tricky since honestly all the Phantoms are pretty similar, which makes coming up with unique moves for each one quite tricky. But I think I would give him a move I would call Gloom Mic Toss. I know, very original. But basically this would act like a normal mic toss, except it inflicts a status effect randomly, which would be a simple effect, but from now on I'm going to try and move on from basic moves but give effect powers, although with all the Phantoms it's a bit hard not to do that. However, for Phantom Freddy's superpower, I'm going to go with something called Phantom Fear, which I stole from Dead by Daylight. But this would be a looming effect where the screen would fog up with the green smoke that shows up on Gloom attacks, and causes all the enemies to become blind and attack their teammates instead of your party, which would be a really nice move. However, with the downside that it would straight up not work on bosses since they can't attack themselves. Let me have that please. Phantom Chica is next, and of course we gotta go with a move called Toxic Pizza, which would work in a very similar way to Bad Pizza, except it inflicts poison on the enemy as well. Her superpower, however, would be called Watermelon, and yes, I actually have an idea. Basically, a giant fucking watermelon would fall from the sky and explode, dealing massive damage to enemies. I know it's a stupid idea, but please let me have it. It's so funny. Like, can you just imagine a giant watermelon just falling from the sky? Phantom Foxy is up next, and for their ability, I want to give them Toxic Cheese, which would just be hot cheese, but it also inflicts poison damage. I know, very original. However, for their superpower, it would be called Phantom Jump Scare, which would act like the jump scare ability, except every attack inflicted on them while they are jump scared gives them the poison effect for that power's duration, which would just be a nice effect. And don't worry, I'll move on from the Phantoms soon. These guys are not that interesting, I'm so sorry. So second to last Phantom, we have Phantom Puppet, which for a move, I came up with an original one called Translucent Boxes, which would be like gift boxes from the base game, except once the character with the box gets hit, it showers the enemy with a random debuff, which would be a cool little idea. Their superpower would be called Phantom Phasing, which would be like an escape key move where it has a chance to instantly steal the soul or kill the enemy. The chance would be 100% for one enemy if there's two or more, and then 50% for every enemy after that, which I think would be a really nice ability, but honestly, not that OP. And finally, we have the last Phantom before I can move on to more interesting characters. Sorry for the Phantom hate. And the last Phantom is Phantom Mangle. Honestly, I think this character should be the one that has Mystery Box 2. And I'm giving them the second variation because Mystery Box 1 is so bad. And for those who don't know, this move completely swaps out your cast for random characters, and Mystery Box 2 actually gives you useful characters. And I would just call this move Mystery Box instead of Mystery Box 1 or 2 because there's only one person who has it. And for their superpower, I'm going with Phantom Mystery Box, which would be very similar to the previous one, except it goes through literally every move in the game and completely swaps out the moves, making the ultimate gamble, and this would also pull from enemy abilities like Fourth Wall and Alarm. So this would either be really strong or be completely useless, and you just lost the entire fight. But anyways, with that, let's move on to the Withered animatronics. Starting with my favorite Withered animatronic, Withered Freddy, and for their power, I want to make a power with Freddy's iconic laugh, which I know would have been more iconic with the original Freddy, but please let me have this. For his power, I would give him the power Withered Laugh, which would make the enemies scared and cause a similar effect to jump scare, but would also make them passively take damage similar to poison during that time. For their superpower, however, I actually have a really cool idea. This idea is called Children's Laughter, which would create a very disturbing effect where the screen becomes dark and enemies get hit with an unknown effect called Darkness, where they can't see, and they also have a 50% chance to just straight up die every 3 seconds the effect is active, which would be about 15 seconds, which is insane, but also quite fitting. So now we have Withered Bonnie, and for their power, of course we have to go with the Withered Punch, which would just be a powerful punch attack that does great damage to one enemy. Something like 500 to 1000 damage could be alright. And for their superpower, of course we have to go with the Missing Arm, where the Missing Arm would just appear out of nowhere and does the same thing the normal punch does, but it affects every enemy on the map. Or if there's just one, it does 4 times the damage it would, which would make him a very strong character, but I think it's justified. For Withered Chica, we gotta make some sort of power related to that jaw, so a move called Withered Bite would be very fitting. And yeah, this move would basically just be Mega Bite, but not an amazing move. However, for their superpower, I want to go with something called Beak Attack, which I think would be more fitting for Toy Chica, but whatever. Basically, Withered Chica would slam the ground with her beak as chickens do and cause a shockwave effect that would damage enemies, but has the downside of not being able to hit enemies that fly, so this would be a very situational ability. And for our final Withered animatronic, we have last but not least, Withered Foxy, and his ability would of course be Hook, but this move would be a lot stronger and cause the enemies to bleed, which would again be similar to Poison with its effects. You can tell I really like the passive damage idea, can't you? For his superpower, I want to go with a pirate themed one, and I have a really funny idea. This power is called Pirate Ship, and yes, it's as dumb as it sounds. When this move activates, a pirate ship would spawn in the background and fire cannonballs at enemies, dealing damage for a certain amount of time, which I think would just be cool and hilarious at the same time. So for our next character, we have a fan favorite of mine. It's not really a fan favorite if it's an individual favorite, but whatever. And this character is Shadow Freddy. Shadow Freddy is the insta-kill killer in FNAF World, and to be honest, I want to keep that. So he would have Escape Key, and I wouldn't change much, although I would up the chances from base FNAF World to make it hit a bit more of the time. And for their main superpower, I will go with an ability I call the Shadow Key, which would work like this. Once active, a bunch of Freddles in shadow form will attack for 15 seconds, with every hit having a 20% chance to instantly kill, which would be an absolute insane ability, but one that I think would be worth it and really suit Shadow Freddy. The puppet is our next character, and you already know what their ability would be. It has to be gift boxes, of course. And before you ask, no, this move will not be buffed. It's the most powerful move in base FNAF World, and there is no need for it to be buffed. Do not whine in the comments. However, their second ability would be a tad different. This ability would be called Music Box, and this move would quite literally put enemies to sleep for 20 seconds, 10 seconds if they're a boss, which could be super powerful, and this would make the puppet arguably the most powerful character in FNAF World, which I think is justified because they are very important to the story. Plus, it's a shame to see such an iconic character be almost useless in the base game, so it's good to give them an actually powerful ability. So now we have reached Golden Freddy, who, considering the lore, is arguably the most important character in the entire series. At least looking at FNAF World, since it's hinted that the figure at the end of the clock ending is the crying child that Golden Freddy they possess Golden Freddy. I don't really know the lore. Who knows at this point? Anyways, Golden Freddy's main power would be Haunting, which would work very similarly as it does in the main game, except it would last longer and just be more effective. Not as strong as Haunting 2 in FNAF World Refreshed, but effective nonetheless. However, his second superpower ability is what's important. I would call this ability It's Me, and it would spawn a massive Golden Freddy head in front of the party, and it would block any special attack but absorbing and breaking the power, including the uncountable fourth wall. Who would have guessed that that was my idea? But anyways, jokes aside, this would be an extremely niche but powerful ability that would make Golden Freddy a must-have against some of the more powerful bosses in the game, and keeping his character's important intact. Plus, it just suits him a lot. Say it with me now, he breaks the fourth wall. So now we go from the most important and interesting characters to the absolute GOAT, and that is Paper Pals. And for their power, I have a really funny idea. Their power would be called Paper Cut, which acts like the hook attack where they cut and cause an enemy to bleed, except it does more and more damage the more you use it. Almost like hot cheese with how it builds up with more attacks. And for their superpower, this was honestly a bit tricky to come up with, because how the fuck do you make paper a power? Until I remembered that paper comes from trees, and trees are pretty fucking dangerous. So let me introduce you to the power Paper Origins, which is pretty simple. A giant fucking tree falls and crushes the enemy, dealing massive damage, but also killing a member of your party. So you use this ability at your own risk. Don't ask why I asked that last part, it's funny, okay? So now we move on to the Nightmares, which I think have some really cool ideas, although for our first character, Nightmare Freddy, I think his power is pretty obvious. It's of course gotta be Freddles, which is just a really good move, but also suits him extremely well since he's where the Freddles come from. Which, you know, kind of made me think, does this guy just undergo mitosis or something? Like, what the hell? Anyways, for a superpower, a move called Freddle Fury sounds like an absolute blast, which would just spam the Freddles move over and over again and spawn more in to make it more effective. I know that's not the most creative, but come on, it just fits him a bit too well. But anyway, let's move on. Nightmare Bonnie is next, and I have a really cool idea for him. For his main power, I'm going with an interesting one in the form of Pizza Wheel. However, it would be as good as the second variation, because we gotta give these guys something, of course. And for their superpower, this is where the cool power comes in. This ability would be called Rabbit Hunting, and this move would actually require you to do more than just press a button. For this move, once activated, you would have 4 holes spawn around the enemies, and you need to select which one you want to use. Each hole would have a plushie version of Normal Bonnie, Nightmare Bonnie, Withered Bonnie, and for a fun surprise, Jacko Bonnie, which, depending on which one you would get, would inflict a different attack onto the enemy, which would be the normal moves that I explained before, but with also doing double the damage. And since we haven't discussed Jacko Bonnie yet, the move this version would have is Jacko Bomb, which means you could get an insane pull if you get Jacko Bonnie when rabbit hunting. This is a fun idea, and the idea of doing more than just selecting a button definitely helps make the battles a bit more interesting, so don't be surprised if a couple similar abilities show up on the list down the line. Which, speaking of, next up we have none other than Nightmare Chica, who of course will have bad pizza as their move. I mean, it makes perfect sense. A chicken in a dream would make a pizza that's gonna make you scream. I'm sorry, I thought I was funny. Anyways, her superpower would be Super Oven, which is gonna be funny. So basically, when this power activates, an oven spawns behind each enemy and a pizza will start to come out of each one over the next 30 seconds. Collect as many pizzas as you can to add to one massive pizza attack at the end of the 30 seconds, which I think would be a really cool ability that requires you to actually pay attention to get good value, which I think could be really cool. For Nightmare Foxy, I really like the idea of a power called Mega Hook, which would act like a normal hook, except it would be insanely good with very high damage and AoE damage. For his superpower, honestly, I'm going with a dash ability called Pirate Dash, and for this move, you would be able to select which opponent you want to use this ability on, and it would deal insane damage, which I think would be really good. But anyways, let's now move on to the Endos. Endo 01 is the first of the 3 Endos, and of course there's 3 in this game. But anyways, for their ability, I think I would give them Power Song, and I would keep it the same, since honestly, with how powerful everyone is now, it would still be very useful. And honestly, I'm gonna go over Endo 02 and Endo Plush right now, because their ideas are pretty much the same. Giving Endo 02 Armor Song and Endo Plush Speed Song. Although I would buff Speed Song to give more speed, and for all 3, they're all getting the exact same superpower, which is a buffed version of Endo Army, which is very fitting if you ask me. And I mean, honestly, there's not much more to these guys, as quite frankly, there are way more important characters to this game. I'm sorry, fellas. Alright, now we move on to Plush Trap, who honestly made me really have to think of an idea since he doesn't really do much. But I decided that I should give him the move Water Hose, and specifically Water Hose 2, since that's a very iconic move from FNAF World and it doesn't really get shown all that much. For their superpower, however, I have a really cool idea. The superpower is called Darkness Revealed, and yes, I play way too much Dead by Daylight, but this power is simple. Once active, the entire screen goes black and you get a flashlight connected to your mouse in which you need to find Plushtrap within a certain amount of time. If you find him, you have Plushtrap throw a massive bad pizza attack which would deal insane damage but also straight up kill anyone who has less than 30% health, no matter who they are or how much they have, which I think would be a really cool effect. Alright, so now we have the man behind the slaughter, our child killer himself, Springtrap. And of course, we gotta give him the move Spring Locks, and we could even buff it a tad. Now, for their superpower, there's a lot of really cool ideas we could make for Springtrap since he is the main bad guy of the series. But after a lot of thinking, I think I have the perfect superpower for him, and that is of course, Remnant Extractor, which would be a draining move where enemies would have their defenses completely removed for 30 seconds, and they would have 50% less strength and speed and slow to take damage, making them very vulnerable, and would make Springtrap a really powerful party member. So next up we have RWQS Shadow Bonnie. Shadow Bonnie is up there with Shadow Freddy as one of the coolest characters in the FNAF series, even if he has the worst U2's plush ever made. And for their ability, I decided to go with Mimic Ball as their main move. However, the timer would be increased to make it a bit more useful. And for their superpower, I would use a move called Shadow Mimic Ball, which would be a very similar move, except it would choose from every move in the game and go through 5 rounds of picking a move, then using that move twice. And this move could be any attack from the game, so if you're really lucky, you could get 10 fourth walls, which would make Shadow Bonnie a really powerful character. Our next character is the Crying Child, and this one's a bit tricky to come up with an ability for. I even considered Waterhouse because, you know, they cry, but for their main move, I ended up making my own called Suffering. Yes, it's very morbid, but how this move works is that it would act as a counter bite attack. For those who don't know, counter bite is a chip where every time the enemy attacks, they get hit with a powerful bite attack, and I think that would be somewhat fitting. However, their real strength would lie in their superpower called Tears of Justice. Yes, I know it's corny, shut the fuck. If you've ever played Bowser's Inside Story and you know how the fat ass Luigi move works, it's the same concept. I'm sorry, that was really out of context. Anyways, once this move is active, a bucket spawns near your mouse and you need to catch the Crying Child's tears, which would fall over the next 5 to 10 seconds. And then, for every tear you catch, 500 damage is applied in one massive water drop, which would be a very powerful damage move with an extra 1000 damage if you grabbed every tear. I think this would be a really cool move, and again, make the combat a bit more interesting because pressing buttons is boring. And now we are getting on to the final few characters. So if you've been enjoying the video so far, make sure you hit that subscribe button to help us hit 100k, and let me know in the comments which idea is your favorite. But let's get into the last 5 characters. So now we have the first Sister Location character, or I guess the character that Sister Location stole from FNAF World. Anyways, that's not important. Funtime Foxy has a lot of really cool moves that they could have, and I think for their main move, Cosmic Song is just too fitting for them. For their superpower, I do actually have a really cool move with a move called Flashbang, which would be a reference to the flashing in Sister Location. While this move is active, the screen will go dark and a flash will show, revealing the whole screen for a second, and revealing where Funtime Foxy is. You then have to click where they are in the dark, and the closer you are to them, the more damage they do to enemies, which would be quite a cool effect. Nightmare Fredbear is next, and I'm sorry, we have to go with Megabyte, it's just too fitting. And honestly, for their main superpower, the Bite of 87.
Was that the Bite of 87?
This move would require you to click certain buttons around the screen, whether it's the arrow keys or WASD, and it would grant you bonus damage to your entire party, something like a 1% increase per successful hit up to 30, which would be an insane cool buffing ability. However, for the last 3 characters, since they are so rare, and I do literally mean that, sometimes people take up to 8 hours to get these characters, I really want to make them the strongest characters, but also stay away from basic attacking powers, which will end up making the game really strong if you get them, as you will see with our next character. Nightmare is very similar to Nightmare Fredbear, and for their base move, I'm actually going to go with Unscrew, which would be more like Unscrew 2, which is a reference to Shadow Freddy, because, you know, he's a black bear. And I know what you're thinking, Jerikai, you just said you're going to make these powers creative, you're a stinky liar. And to that I say, the fuck I'm not, because Nightmare's superpower would be something amazing, and it would be called Nightmare. I know, I'm very original. Anyways, this power would basically be Hocus Pocus, but actually good. What this would do is give you 2 options. For the next minute, you get to swap out one party member with someone stronger or weaker, although stronger if you want to win. Or swap out one enemy to a weaker one, and for bosses, this would swap to a weaker boss for 30 seconds, which I think would be an insane effect and could make for some really interesting gameplay. Alright, second to last, we have Fredbear, who has been our party leader this whole time, and believe it or not, I'm giving him 4th wall as his main ability. Now granted, it wouldn't nearly be as strong as it is in-game, only starting with 1000 damage at level 1, and this is a reference to the 4th wall ending, and I just think it would be extremely fitting for him to have this move. However, for their superpower, I gotta go with a move I want to call Guide the Party, which would be almost like a 2D style minigame you need to complete, which depending on how far you make it, imagine the minigame is like that dinosaur minigame on Google, you get a ton of buffs, almost like a really strong party favors, having teammates attack do upwards of 4 times their usual values, which would be an extremely strong ability to have and very fun to use. And finally, last but not least, we have Spring Bonnie, which considering he is the rarest character in the game, I want to give him a really powerful ability, and I want it to be relating to the shields. So for their main ability, it'll be Neon Wall, but it would also have a halfway point between Neon Wall 1 and 2, where it makes you invincible for the first 5 seconds, and then you get 30 to 45 seconds of the main shield. However, their superpower would be Mega Shield, which would literally be 30 to 45 seconds of complete invincibility, which would be an insanely powerful, but a move that I think is extremely fitting for such a rare character, and would literally make it the strongest move in the game, so it'd be worth it. And with that, we have covered every single character in FNAF World and given them a unique ability to make each one stand out. It's been a while since I've made one of these, and I had an absolute blast making this video and coming up with ideas, so if you enjoyed, please be sure to like, subscribe, hype the video because you can do that now, and share this video with your friends to help us hit 100k by the end of the year. It would be absolutely incredible if you could help me do that, since at 100k, I'm personally thanking every single subscriber in one massive live streams. And speaking of live streams, on the 13th, 14th, and 15th of November, I'm hosting a massive Dead by Daylight charity tournament with fellow YouTuber Narrow Raven right here on this channel. So it would be absolutely amazing if you could subscribe to check that out. It's going to feature a ton of creators and it will be a ton of fun. But with that, I'm going to shut up now. Thank you so much for sticking around and watching this video to the very end, and I'll see you next time.